If you had the chance to be a hero, would you take it? Even if it meant putting yourself in harm's way? Tonight we have 3 stories. One longer one detailing a man who sees a creeper in a woman's backseat, and 2 shorter ones with their own terrors to share. A huge thank you to all of tonight's writers for allowing me to share their stories. Without them, this video wouldn't have been possible. Remember to send in your story if you'd like to have it featured. You can either submit it at my subreddit, r/slumberreads, or my email you can find in the description. Be sure to drop a like if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. It was nearly midnight when I first saw her. There was only one 24-hour grocery store in my small hometown, and she looked as out of place as anyone could possibly be. Rather than wearing the old, faded denims that all the townspeople seem to prefer, she was dressed in a white, pressed blouse and an obviously expensive black, pencil skirt that reached to just above her knees. She stood out like a sore thumb. Unlike most of the working-class farmers in our area, she didn't dress plainly, nor did she look old before her time. Her smooth, creamy white skin and long blonde hair revealed a pampered lifestyle that none of the townsfolk here could possibly afford. She also had wide, innocent green eyes that seemed oblivious to the harsh realities of this world. And I was instantly smitten. We had both arrived at the mom and pop shop at the exact same time. Myself, I had come for some late-night microwave pizza and a few beers. And she, well, I could only wonder as to what had brought such a beautiful and sophisticated young woman to this small place, and at such a late hour. I froze in my steps when I noticed her. She swept by me with a shy smile and continued into the small establishment. I shook my head in an effort to clear my thoughts and followed her through the dimly lit entrance of the store. I made it quickly to the frozen food aisle to grab my pizza, and then moved on to the wider beer and liquor section of the market. I was pleasantly surprised to find the same woman also standing there, seemingly debating over 2 brands of red wine. She looked up at me as I approached and gave me another quick smile as she hastily returned 1 bottle to the shelf and turned to walk purposely toward the checkout line. I hurriedly picked up a 12-pack of my favorite brand and followed after her. Due to the late hour, there was only 1 checkout lane open, and I impatiently took note of the other shoppers standing in line. There was an old woman whom I instantly recognized as Dorothy Woodsworth at the front. She watched with an eagle's eyes the checker rang up her meager items, her fist tightly clenched over what looked to be a stack of painstakingly clipped coupons. Behind her was a rather disheveled and dirty-looking man in his late 30s. I didn't recognize him, but with his numerous piercings, tattoos, and a strong stench of alcohol and body odor, I was instantly on guard. The town had so few residents, and even fewer tourists, that I found it very odd to come across 2 strangers in the same night, especially at the same location. He must be a drifter, I decided, and a rather suspicious-looking one at that. Even more disconcerting than the man's appearance was the suspicious items that he was purchasing. I saw a box cutter, zip ties, garbage bags, and a large amount of duct tape crowded into his small shopping basket. I somehow doubted that a man like this was starting some late-night home improvement project. I instantly felt myself reacting as any young, hot-blooded male would. I puffed out my chest, flexed my muscles, and met his dark eyes in a "you don't scare me" kind of way. Behind the drifter, but in front of myself, stood her. The beautiful young woman that I had been ogling this entire trip. Much to my dismay, the dirty man's gaze also seemed to focus on the young woman. His tongue kept darting out to wet his dry, chapped lips as his eyes raked up and down her body in a clearly lustful way. I felt my protective instincts roar to life as I watched her uncomfortable gaze dart quickly from old Mrs. Woodsworth to the strange man and back again, as though seeking a safe place to land. I racked my brain for some form of conversation that would distract the girl from the man's inappropriate scrutiny and put her more at ease. "Hi there. Buying some wine, huh?" The words just fell out of my mouth, and I visibly winced as I stated the painfully obvious in a choked voice. The unkempt man snorted and gave me an amused and knowing look. I mean, yeah, I'm having a late night dinner with a friend, she calmly said with a relieved smile. Her voice was as soft and alluring as the rest of her, and I instantly felt my body start to relax. I couldn't help but hope that there was more than just gratitude behind that smile. Oh, dinner, that sounds nice, I replied awkwardly. Must be going on a date then, huh? She opened her mouth as if to reply to my question, but after a moment, she shut it again and turned her eyes toward the cashier without answering me. Too shy and embarrassed to press her further, I also turned my attention solely to the cashier and attempted to pretend that no one else existed. The young man, whom I vaguely recognized as the grandson of the owners, Timmy or Jimmy I think was his name, made quick, competent work of everyone's purchases, and before I knew it, I was all paid up and walking towards the store exit. The same mysterious woman walking only a short distance in front of me. Once I reached the parking lot, I watched as she quickly walked to a car a few spaces away, placed the wine in her trunk, and unlocked her car doors. I was already at my truck as I parked closer to the store than her, and was about to climb into the driver's seat when something came over me. A last-ditch attempt to catch the girl of my dreams, I suppose. Hey, I called out to her. My name is Sam, and I don't mean to bother you, but I would really like to know your name. And well, do you have a boyfriend or anything? The girl paused in her motion to open her door and raised one perfectly groomed eyebrow in answer to my question. Damn, that sounded awkward and far too needy to be anything even approaching casual. But then I always had been somewhat awkward around the ladies. I mean, well, do you? She smiled briefly, revealing a cute little dimple in her left cheek, and I felt my heart melt even more. I'm Mina, and no, I don't have anyone like that. But please just trust me when I say that you don't want to get involved with me. I am too much trouble. With that, she flicked back her long hair with a careless movement of her pale, perfectly manicured fingers and slid into the front seat of her luxury car. Following suit, I plopped down into the driver's seat of my beat-up pickup inside. Wow, smooth. I sarcastically taunted myself. I can't imagine why she didn't just fall into your lap after such a brilliant line like that. Punching my steering wheel in several frustrated movements, I gloomily watched her car back up and head towards the exit of the parking lot. It was then that I noticed the top of a head peeking out of her rear window, barely visible in the backseat of her car. Oh, wait, what the? I trailed off, and I quickly backed out of my parking space to follow her car towards the exit. It was only when I was directly behind her that I realized I recognized whose head I had seen peering at me from her rear windshield. The long, greasy hair together with the reflection of the store's lights glinting off his many piercings finally clued me into who this was. Somehow, the same dirty man who was in line before us had slipped into the back of her car without her noticing. He quickly ducked back down below eye level until I could no longer see him. Meanwhile, she had switched on her turn signal, indicating that she was going to turn left out of the parking lot. Even though my home was in the opposite direction, I too flipped on my left turn signal and prepared to follow her. I was concerned for her safety. Given the rough appearance of the man and the fact that he was obviously hiding out in her car, I knew he must have bad intentions. There was just no other explanation. I fought the urge to simply blare my horn at her, knowing that the man was quite possibly armed and able to cause her fatal injury if he knew that he had been discovered. Instead, I followed closely behind her as she slowly made her way through the streets of downtown and then turned off to a smaller, less brightly lit road. I considered then rejected several strategies that might get her out of her car without alerting the menacing stowaway in her backseat. Several nerve-wracking minutes passed as she navigated through town before finally turning into an all-night gas station, and my heart leapt. Thank God, this was my chance. I quickly turned in behind her and stopped at the pump adjacent to hers. At this time of night, I could see no other patrons, and only one scrawny teenage boy who seemed to be manning the register from inside the small building. There was really no one else in sight. I could see no sign of the man in her backseat, and concluded that he must have flattened himself onto the floor of her car. I climbed out of my front seat and pretended to start gassing up my already full tank. I tried to appear nonchalant as I knew I had to be smart about this. If I just ran over to her screaming, as my first instincts demanded, then I would likely just frighten her back into her car, then be back at square one. She got out of her vehicle and looked at me somewhat suspiciously as she began pumping her gas. I opened and closed my mouth several times, my mind racing to come up with a plan to get her away from her car. "You know, this place has great coffee," I began. "Could I buy you a quick cup?" She made an exasperated sound in the back of her throat before replying, "Boy, you just don't give up, do you?" Attempting a casual smile, I said, "I just really think we should get to know each other. That's all. Just give me 10 minutes, 1 cup of coffee, and you're still not interested. You can go on your way, and I promise to never bother you again." Please let this work," my mind chanted over and over again. "I really can't," she finally said. "Look, you seem like a nice guy, but I'm just not interested. Sorry." Damn. I had meant to say that out loud, and once it came out, it sounded rather angry. I watched helplessly as she took a frightened step back and looked down at the gas nozzle that I had just been holding, not even bothering to put it into my tank as it was already full. "You followed me here, didn't you?" she asked accusingly. "Listen, man, I've tried to be nice, but if you don't back off right now, I'm going to call the cops. Do you understand?" She angrily finished pumping her gas and slammed the nozzle back into position at the pump. She had every right to be upset, and I knew that I was probably scaring the hell out of the poor girl. I just didn't know what else to do. I was not the kind of man who could just leave a helpless woman to the wicked plans of a deranged man. I returned the nozzle to his compartment as I briefly considered calling the police myself. We only had one sheriff, who always left the station promptly at 6 every morning. That left only a single, young deputy whom the whole town knew to be drunk far more often than not. I couldn't help but think it would be the wrong move to involve him. If this guy was armed and got spooked, he could kill her long before we got close enough to stop him. The situation required far more delicacy than an inebriated and inexperienced cop would be capable of. But then, what should I do? She was just about to climb back in her car when I desperately called out, "Wait, Mina, don't go. Your tire is flat. Come see." She made a movement as if she was about to get back out to check, but then she merely shot me a fearful look over her shoulder and started her engine. I quickly jumped back into my pickup and fired up the engine. When she turned out of the parking lot, I hesitated a few moments before turning behind her. I followed slowly at what I hoped was a discreet distance and tried to plan my next move. I was cursing myself for not thinking of writing her a note and slipping it discreetly to her somehow. If only I had thought of that sooner. She made several turns which led her out of the downtown area and eventually turned down what appeared to be a long dirt road. I had thought I knew every inch of this city, but I soon found myself in unfamiliar territory. I followed about 200 yards behind her, and the tall stalks of corn on either side of the narrow road caused eerie shadows to dance on my windshield. My heart and mind seemed to be in a competitive sprint, and I knew that the finish line lay somewhere at the end of this rural road. There was no other option. I would just keep my distance until she reached her destination, and then once she stopped, I would intervene when the man made his move. I was too far away to see into her vehicle now, but would still catch the occasional glimpse of what looked like a top silhouette of a head through her back window. I took a mental inventory of everything I had in my truck that could aid me. I had a cell phone with a flashlight, and thankfully also had an old shotgun that my dad had lent me for a hunting trip several weeks prior. I hated hunting. I was not a violent man and couldn't understand the thrill my friends seemed to get from taking down a defenseless animal. But there wasn't much to do in my hometown, and hunting had always been my buddy's favorite pastime. I was actually very thankful for that now. After driving through the darkness for what seemed an interminable amount of time, I suddenly realized that I could no longer see the black lights of Mina's car. I slowed my speed down to a crawl and scanned the area up ahead and to the sides, thinking that the man might have decided to force Mina to drive into the cornfields. I watched the road closely for any fresh tire tracks, but I saw nothing. After traveling the road for another couple of minutes, I pulled my truck over, removed the shotgun from the rack behind my seat, and cautiously climbed out. The sounds of night creatures and crickets was nearly deafening way out here, and the still, hot air began to coat every inch of my skin with slick sweat. I could see nothing around me, and was just about to give up to my crushing defeat to save Mina when I heard a loud, shrill cry. I quickly jumped in the direction of the scream, and it was only then that I noticed what looked to be a huge old barn roughly 300 yards behind me. How the hell did I miss that? I cursed myself as I jumped back into my truck, tossing the shotgun into the passenger seat, and somehow managing to only take out a few of the towering stalks of corn in my haste to get turned back around on the road. No longer concerned about stealth, I roared down the road as dirt and bits of rock hammered at my truck. Realizing that the situation had escalated far beyond my control, I quickly whipped out my cell phone and dialed the emergency police number. It rang 11 times and I was near to hanging up when a sleepy male voice came on the line.
Emergency. What's your location?
Came the familiar, slurred voice of the deputy. Damn. Why couldn't he have been sober? Just this once. As quickly as I could, I relayed the night's events, trying to speak in a clear, concise voice so that even a drunk hillbilly could comprehend the urgency of the situation.
This had better not be a prank,
the deputy said, after I had finished my explanation, suddenly sounding far more sober, kind of, with only a tiny hint of the slur still evident in his voice. I felt my hopes rise slightly.
We've had a string of people go missing this week, and so far, there have been 0 real leads. If what you're saying is true, then this girl could be in very real danger.
It's definitely not a prank, I quickly assured him. My name is Sam Larson, and I don't know the exact address, but I am in a large cornfield roughly 8 miles west of the Hillards farm. There's a huge barn or something in the center, and that's where I believe the woman is being held. I heard a scream a few minutes ago, but nothing else since, and I need to go in. I was abruptly cut off by several fast beeping noises on the line. Looking down at my phone, I realized that the phone was no longer getting a signal. In such a rural area, cell phones here were notoriously unreliable. I tried calling back, but it quickly became obvious that I had no service. Damn it, I yelled, and threw the phone onto the seat in frustration. I was on my own now. There was no time to try to move to a place with a better signal. The poor woman might already be dead at this point, and I needed to act now. I switched off my headlights and slowed the truck down to a slow crawl, and I approached the old barn. I could see Mina's expensive black car parked carelessly in front of the decrepit old building, both of its doors left wide open. Beyond that, there was no other sign of life. Quickly scooping up the shotgun and repocketing my cell phone, I opened the driver's side door and stealthily slid out of my truck. I was hypersensitive to the slightest noise, as I cautiously made my way towards the structure. Peeking into the nearest, grime-smudged window, I could vaguely make out 2 people. One was seated in a chair and seemed to be struggling against some type of restraints. The other stood a few feet away, and it looked as though they held something large and threatening with both their hands. Both figures seemed to be arguing based on their hand movements, and the muffled shouts I could barely hear through the thick walls. I walked around the entirety of the structure until I came to a large hole where the wood had disintegrated just enough so that I could crawl through without alerting them of my presence. Once inside, their voices were much clearer to me. Please, just let me go. I'll give you whatever you want, and I won't tell anyone what happened here. I swear. It sickened me to hear this sweet young woman begging for her life, and I felt a white-hot rage begin to well within me, replacing my earlier fear. It was almost completely dark inside. The only light seemed to come from a small candle or lantern towards the front of the building where the voices originated. I could see several long shadows cast onto the floor and walls of the barn. 2 of them clearly belonged to Mina and the drifter, but there were also at least half a dozen large shadows that seemed to hang down from the ceiling. They were raised several feet off the ground and seemed to sway gently back and forth. I assumed that they were simply large farm tools and paid them little heed beyond the thought that I could potentially use one of them as a weapon. There was a thick, putrid odor that seemed to permeate the air, and I had to choke back bile as it rose in my throat. Creeping closer, I crawled my way around the moldy bales of hay and fallen beams, trying desperately to be swift but silent. Anything I want, huh? I heard a man's deep, menacing voice say. Well, that's a mighty tempting offer, but one I plan to take you up on. Of course, what I really want is you. I just want to have some fun, you know? There ain't much to do around these parts except hunt, and I believe I have already bagged my prize. Just as with any fine young doe, I will start by stringing you up. I will skin and gut you, and then separate the choice bits. The woman began to sob hysterically, and I quickened my pace, only slowing when I was mere feet from their location. I could see small tufts of smoke rising from an old-fashioned oil lamp that was set on a workbench next to several sharp knives and what looked like ancient, dirty surgical instruments. The lantern gave off so little light in the cavernous old barn that I felt I was still sufficiently hidden from view. I quickly turned my attention to the woman who did indeed appear to be strapped tightly to an antique wooden chair. She was softly whimpering what sounded like a garbled prayer, and her long hair was tangled around her tear-streaked face. Before I could pinpoint exactly where the male stood, I felt several beads of sweat trickle down my forehead into my eyes, stinging them and blurring my vision. I hurriedly swiped at one eye with my free hand before pressing it back down onto the ground. I was surprised when my hand landed in something wet and sticky, and on reflex, I recoiled and looked down. Even in the low light, I could still make out the small pool of thick, dark liquid. Oil? That was my first thought, but after a quick sniff, I realized that it was blood. I froze when another drop landed from above my head to join the growing puddle. Slowly, reluctantly, I raised my head and nearly screamed in horror. A naked corpse, strung up by the feet, dangled only a few feet above me. It had once been a man. Though he had been savagely mutilated beyond all recognition, though he was clearly deceased, fresh blood still dripped from several gaping wounds. I felt bile rise in my throat once again, and the urge to flee was so strong that it nearly overpowered me. Once the thought of Mina, her beautiful body stripped of both flesh and dignity, and strung up like an animal, kept me from noping my way out of there right that second. You can do this, I told myself. You have the shotgun, and you know how to defend yourself. Besides, the cops will be here any minute now. That is, if they can find you. How can you be sure the deputy even heard your description of this place before the call was dropped? No, don't think like that. The cops will come, and if not, you can always just shoot the guy. Just as I was wrapping up my internal pep talk, 2 large black boots suddenly came stomping in my line of vision. My eyes darted up the entire length of the drifter, who suddenly seemed 10 feet taller and twice as broad in my panicked state. He was holding a large machete and kept tightening, then loosening his grip on it in a very unsettling way. It was clear that he was anxious to use it. He smiled broadly before saying, I thought I heard a rat scurrying around in the dark. Looks like I was right. Such a determined little guy. Mina said it best, I think. You just don't give up, do you? Well, you know what they say. No good deed goes unpunished. And you will be punished. That much I can promise you. That voice. It was Mina. I watched in shock as she sauntered over to stand next to the huge brute. The same wide, eerie smile on her beautiful face. How had she gotten out of the chair? That was the only question my terrified brain could conjure at the moment. I clumsily struggled to my feet, still gripping the shotgun in one hand. Though at the time, I don't think I was even aware I still held it. Everything seemed to move in slow motion, and my mind felt like an old computer that had been unceremoniously shut down and was struggling to reboot. My hero, Mina said in an ugly, mocking tone. You came to save the poor damsel in distress from a cruel trap. I bet you never once thought that trap might have actually been set for you. Don't feel bad, though. You're not the only one. They never see it coming. Men like you make this only too easy. Almost takes the fun out of it all. I could only stare blankly at both of them for several seconds, as I felt my stomach swiftly drop and my comprehension slowly dawn. They were in this together. They planned this whole damn thing, and the disappearances the deputy mentioned. Why would you do this? I only wanted to help you. I've been chasing this guy all night trying to keep you safe. I cared about you. I tripped over all the questions flooding up my throat. Did you do the same thing to the poor fool strung up behind me? You're sick. Both of you. You all like to hunt here, right? Mina responded in a sugary sweet tone. You think nothing of setting your traps and stacking the odds in your favor. Well, I like to hunt too. She shrugged her shoulders. And at least I hunt on an even playing ground. I choose game that is intellectually and physically matched to myself. And even you can't argue that I gave you several chances to flee. I told you I was nothing but trouble. It's not my fault that you choose not to listen. Stop playing with your food, Mina. Mikhail suddenly snapped. That's a very bad habit of yours, and I will never understand why you enjoy this elaborate little game so much. Let's just finish him and get the hell out of here. Mina pouted prettily at the man before she shrugged once more. I just enjoy the irony, I suppose. But fine. You win, Mikhail. I have had my fun now. You can have yours. They both lunged at me. Mikhail grabbed for my shotgun, and Mina reaching for my throat. They moved with well-practiced speed and precision as my body suddenly leapt back into action. With as much force as I could muster, I drove the flat end of my shotgun into the front of the man's throat, at the same time twisting my body to the side to avoid Mina's clawing attack. Mikhail went down hard on his knees, both hands clutching his neck as he struggled to breathe. Mina also fell, thrown off balance by the velocity of her lunge and the suddenness of my evasive movement. Thank God. I've always disliked hunting so much. I thought to myself, while my friends were always off camping with their dads. I took 4 years of jujitsu. Using the pair's distraction to my advantage, I ran the short distance to the large front door of the barn. I pulled forcibly on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was then that I noticed a large, intimidating padlock at the top. It was holding the doors firmly in place. I knew I was not getting out this way, not without the key. I could hear movement behind me, and quickly turned to see Mikhail fast approaching, the large machete still clutched in one hand. He looked pissed. I took off towards the rear of the building, intending to go back through the hole in which I had first entered. It was only at that moment that I had my first full view of the entire room. I froze in mid-step as I took it all in. There was not just the one corpse hanging from the ceiling, but many. At least 10 bodies were visible in the lantern light. Some were missing limbs, fingers, or toes. There were a mixture of male and female bodies, and one poor boy looked like he couldn't have been more than 13 years old. He appeared to be the newest of their victims. His body had been ravaged and torn, but he showed no obvious signs of decay, and blood still poured freely from his wounds. All of these people wore identical looks of terror, and pain frozen in their tortured faces. I realized then what I had originally taken for large farm equipment upon first entering had actually been corpses. So many of them. Before I could force myself to resume running towards freedom, I felt a quick, sharp pain in the back of my skull and then nothingness. I awoke to a feeling of pain and a strong pressure centered in my head. Upon opening my sore eyes, I saw that the whole world was upside down and spinning. I quickly closed my eyes again and took a few deep breaths to gather myself and tried to get my bearings. My memories were just a haze of blood and terror, and it took several seconds to sort through them all. Once everything came back to me, my eyes flashed back open, and I struggled violently to move, to flee. I couldn't feel my limbs. My arms and legs refused to move. Worst of all, the world outside of my tightly clenched eyelids was still spinning out of control, and I could tell that I was definitely upside down. I craned my neck upwards, already knowing what I would see. My feet and hands were restrained with zip ties, and I was hanging from thick ropes looped around a large hook that had been attached to one of the barn high rafters. Damn. I could hear the low murmur of voices and the loud scraping of metal on metal. I caught the scent of something burning, flowing by the thud of approaching footsteps. I closed my eyes nearly all the way and pretended to be still unconscious as the two figures came into view. Mikhail now held a large, rusted surgical blade, and Mina had what appeared to be a fire poker. No, it was a branding iron, and the tip glowed like a fiery orange hue. I knew it was coming next as my shirt was roughly ripped away from my chest. I remained as still as possible, trying not to panic as Mina leaned in close. "Wakey, wakey," she started to say, as I roughly drove the blunt part of my forehead into the tender skin above her nose. "Ouch, what the hell?" She trailed off, dropping her torture instrument as she grasped her gushing nose. "They may very well kill me tonight, but I am not going down without getting a few licks in myself," I thought. Mikhail grabbed me roughly by the hair, twisting my face as he punched me so hard that I nearly passed out again. "You will pay dearly for that," he spat as he sliced a long, deep gash into my chest. "What's the matter?" I asked, hearing the nasally sound of my own voice, and knowing that my nose was likely now as broken as Mina's. "You said that you wanted an even playing field, remember?" Couldn't help taunting. Maybe I hadn't made them angry enough they would just kill me quickly, and I wouldn't be subjected to hours of torture first. Mikhail just laughed at me though. That same wide and creepy grin that held more than a hint of madness in it. That was Mina who said that, not me. You see, I don't care if it's even or fair. I just enjoy the screams and the meat. He leaned down to pick up the discarded branding iron, careful to keep enough distance between us, but Mina was quick to swipe it back out of his hands, jabbing the business end of it directly above my heart as blood continued to stream down her chin. I couldn't help myself then. I gave Mikhail those streams as an agony beyond bearing flared throughout my entire body. "You're mine now, forever," Mina said softly in the same nasally tone that I had used moments before, and I took a sick sense of satisfaction in that. Definitely broken, I thought as the world started going dark again. I was quickly snapped back out of that welcoming darkness by a deluge of ice-cold water in my face. I opened my eyes sluggishly to find 4 identical Mikhails standing upside down before me, each holding the same blood-coated scalpel in his hands, and grinning maniacally. I blinked several times to clear my eyes of water, and the 4 images finally merged back to just one. Before I could brace myself, he plunged the instrument deep into my left thigh, and I could hear, more than feel, a wet squish as my flesh was ripped open several inches. I think my limbs must have lost more of their sensation due to the tightness of my bonds and the fact that all of the blood was rushing into my brain. Thank God for that tiny mercy. I knew then that I was going to die here tonight, and these 2 murderous psychopaths would then desecrate my corpse, just as they had done to so many others. They would be long gone before the deputy or anyone else ever found me. My overwrought mind was desperately looking for an escape, not a physical one. I knew that was impossible. All I wanted in that moment was to mentally slip from the reality of what was happening to me and find a warm, soft place to burrow into. Another long, deep cut was carved into my opposite thigh. For some reason then, I thought of my mother. She had died in a horrific car accident when I was only 9 years old. Her sudden death had devastated me back then. My father toiled long hours on our farm, and as a young child, she had been my whole world. Her name was Samantha, and I, their only child, had been named after her. Dad had never been the same after that. My mind vaguely registered it, as a serrated blade of some kind began to saw back and forth through the muscles and tendons that lay a foot below my groin. My father had started coming in later, and later every night. I think he just couldn't handle stepping foot into a house that she no longer occupied. I felt Mina's hand lovingly stroke the side of my cheek, right before she again plunged the fiery iron against my neck. This time, though, I didn't scream. Instead, I put all of my energy into summoning back the images of my family. Eventually, my dad and I had fallen into a sad and lonely routine, both too immersed in our own grief to acknowledge or care about each other's pain. Over time, though, things started to get better, for me, at least. Mikhail's fist thudded painfully over and over against the sensitive flesh of my rib cage, and I heard him laugh jokingly about the need to tenderize the meat. I ignored his taunts and burrowed further inside of myself. My father's sister eventually came to live with us and help around the house. She was a kind and loving woman who gave me the maternal affection that I had so utterly craved. I also became good friends with a boy named Mike who lived down the road from me, and he, in turn, included me in his much larger circle of friends. I felt bone crunch, and then my ears picked up on a high-pitched laugh as it pierced sharply through the fog of my memories, and I struggled frantically to cocoon myself in them once more. I am ashamed to say, but I eventually began to forget my mother, piece by piece. First, it was her smile. She had this small gap in her front teeth, though it never detracted from the beauty of that smile. Then I had to really struggle to remember the deep, throaty laugh that she always bellowed out when something amused her. The sound had been so contagious and sincere that no matter how badly I was feeling that day, I always started laughing too. Last to go, I think, was her scent. She always smelled of the roses she had been so lovingly tended to, and the fresh, clean lather of the soap she used. All of those things and more came flooding back into my consciousness, and it was bittersweet. I missed her so much. I comforted myself with the knowledge that if there really was any type of an afterlife, I would be seeing her again soon. The sharp, agonizing sensation of my femur splitting in two pulled me roughly out of the past once again, and no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't seem to go back under. I knew I was losing far too much blood to last much longer. The sick smell of iron and decay that had once permeated this hell slowly gave way to another far sweeter, and I inhaled deeply as I imagined the scent of my mother's roses now hung in the air. I resigned myself to my death, and even through my agony, I smiled. Ah, you like that, don't you? Well, then you're going to love what comes next. Mikhail's voice cut off abruptly as the sound of several male voices suddenly shouted at him to get down on the ground. Finally, Mikhail was no longer grinning as shock and fear quickly replaced his smug expression. I watched from outside of myself as he raised the bloody knife he held and began to run in the direction of the armed police officers, who had seemed to appear out of nowhere from the back of the barn. They were all standing behind where my body still hung from the rafters, and I should not have been able to see them, or what happened next. Mikhail shrieked a demented war cry as he lunged at the men, giving the officers no other choice but to fire on him. I watched his body jerked over and over from the barrage of countless bullets, and then he finally dropped to his knees before finally landing face down on the filthy mixture of fermented hay and old blood and viscera that coated the ground. Mina just stood there, seemingly frozen in shock, as the police swarmed the old barn. They ordered her down to the ground and she complied woodenly. She was quickly cuffed, but then one of the officers told her that everything was going to be okay now and that she was not under arrest. They just needed to secure the crime scene. She shot me a quick, evil look over her shoulder and then turned back to the cops and began sobbing and thanking the men for saving her from the evil man. They don't know she's involved, I thought to myself. I knew that I had lost a tremendous amount of blood at that point. The fact that I was watching all of this unfold from outside of myself struck a mortal terror into my soul. I knew that I was close to death, and I also understood that if I died here tonight, she would be free to go on killing. I was the only one at this point who knew the depth of her complicity in all these twisted murders. I had to keep fighting. For the first time that night, I prayed. I cried out with all of my being to a God that I wasn't even sure existed. At that moment, I slammed forcefully back inside myself. The first thing that hit me was the pain. It washed over my entire being like a tidal wave of misery, and for several moments, I couldn't even breathe. Then I began struggling and pulling at my restraints with a strength that I didn't know I possessed. I shouted out to the men, words that only sounded like panicked gibberish, even to my own ears. 3 of the police ran over to me, calling out for the paramedics as they urged me to stay calm. Help was on the way. Mina, I croaked. She and Mikhail. All of a sudden, I could feel the ties holding my limbs abruptly loosen as I was cut loose, and that tidal wave of pain became an ocean of fire as feelings surged back through my nerve endings. I could no longer speak as I was gently lowered to the ground by the men. The EMTs then swarmed over me, quickly attaching several electrodes and IVs to my battered body. It was a scene of organized chaos around me. I could hear the murmured voices and occasional retching of the officers as they took in the full scope of Mikhail and Mina's depravity. My ears dimly registered the distant peal of sirens, Mina's loud sobs, and my father's voice bellowing my name and demanding to be let in to see me. All of my strength left me then. My vision began to dim once again, and I could feel myself drifting away. Before I lost complete consciousness, however, I heard my name being called again. This time, though, it was gentle, a feminine whisper from a darkened corner of the room. All other sounds faded as I slowly turned my head towards the achingly familiar voice. There in the corner stood a woman in her early 30s. A sweet smile parted her lips, revealing a tiny, beloved gap in her front teeth. I stretched my fingers in her direction as the overwhelming aroma of flowers and fresh soap filled my nostrils. I woke in the hospital 3 days later. My father, an aunt, and the sheriff were all seated at my bedside. They both looked grim and exhausted, but smiled warmly at me. When I stirred and opened my eyes, the sheriff explained step by step what happened after my emergency call to his deputy had been dropped. The sheriff and the state police had both been called immediately afterwards. Due to the severity of the situation and the fact so many people had been reported missing, an emergency task force had quickly been sent to the town. Using the vague directions and location I had been able to give them, a massive search began. Despite the swiftness of their actions, it had still taken nearly 2 hours to discover exactly where I was being held. By the time they finally found me, I had lost so much blood that the doctors and EMTs had serious doubts that I would survive. My only saving grace had been a tourniquet that Mikhail had applied to my thigh before hacking away at it. I knew why he had done that. He hadn't wanted me to die too quickly. He enjoyed every minute of his torture, and the sick bastard had wanted me to suffer. Knowing this, and everything else he had done, I was disappointed that he hadn't been the one to suffer more. His death had been far too swift and painless. I would learn many things over the next several days. Not all of it was welcome. Mina had fled the hospital before they discovered that she had not been a victim but a sadistic participant in the grisly murders. The police had pulled 11 corpses from the barn that night, though it was believed that she and Mikhail may have been responsible for over 80 similar torture deaths across the country over the last 7 years. As I had already feared, she had not been under suspicion that night, and was long gone before the police had started to collect the evidence that would later prove her involvement. Last I heard, the authorities are still searching for her. But there was also a bit of good news too. 2 victims came out of this alive, if not unscathed. Myself, and a 14-year-old boy who I later learned had been caught by the psychotic couple the night before this story took place. He was the son of a nearby farmer who had gone to the old barn to investigate the odd smells and screams that had been emanating from the abandoned building the previous week. Turns out, he was very much into the paranormal and had thought the structure to be haunted, and in a way, I suppose it was. He had been caught, tortured, and left to hang in the barn while the couple ran to the store for more supplies. That's when I had the misfortune to cross paths with them. They had planned to finish him that night. The boy, his name was Thomas, later revealed. He had heard them discussing their plans to finish him off, celebrate with a bottle of red wine, and then move on to a new town the next day. Thomas was the teenager I had seen strung up on that terrible night in that barn, right before my own ordeal had begun. I had thought him dead at the time, but he had merely been unconscious from blood loss and exhaustion. Thomas and I would thankfully go on to make full recoveries, though I will always walk with a limp, and we both still bear some pretty vicious scarring on our bodies. We were both just thankful to be alive, though. Thomas came to visit me in my hospital room 2 days after I awoke. He introduced himself, and he said he wanted to thank me for ultimately leading the police to his location. I didn't feel much like a hero, though. I had been so duped by Mina's pretty face and the idea that I could be her knight in shining armor that I had never considered that there could be anything more to the situation. Before leaving my room that morning, Thomas turned to me and asked in a very hesitant voice if I too had seen the lady in the white dress on the night of our rescue. I looked at him in confusion for a moment, having no idea whom he could possibly be referring to. Seeing my puzzled expression, he then added that she had been a pretty woman with dark hair and eyes like mine, as she had a small gap in her teeth, and she smelled of roses. I knew exactly who he meant then, though I could hardly believe it. Thomas had also seen my mother that night. I had thought her to be merely a hallucination caused by trauma and too much blood loss, but the way Thomas described her, she must have really been there, in one form or another. After speaking with others who had been at the scene that night, no one else claimed to have seen her, not even my father. I can only assume that this was due to one of two things. Thomas and I had both been dying in that moment, and perhaps coming so close to death lessened the barrier between this life and the afterlife. Or maybe my mother had just sought to comfort two scared and traumatized boys. That sounded a lot like the woman I had known as a child. It has been 4 years since that horrific night, and I have tried desperately to put all of this behind me. I moved to the city shortly afterwards. The numerous cornfields, dirt roads, and old barns that surrounded my small town were just far too anxiety-inducing for me. I needed the bright lights and the busy crowds of a city just to be able to sleep. Even here, I find myself unable to quiet my mind enough to drift off most nights. I have become an insomniac, often spending many late hours at my computer surfing YouTube, creepypasta wikis, and Reddit. I think in some odd way, it relaxes me to read about creatures not of this world. Perhaps it distracts me from thoughts of the real monsters that roam this planet. And that is what has brought me to sharing this story with all of you. I have become aware of a certain urban legend about men who see a young woman, seemingly alone and unprotected late at night. You may have read some of these stories yourself, though the places and circumstances differ. The theme is always the same. These men notice a creepy guy lurking in the young woman's backseat, one whom she is seemingly unaware of. They go to great lengths trying to convince her to leave her car and go with them to safety, all without alerting the dangerous man hiding in her car. Sound familiar? Without fail, every time a story like this is posted, it ends up with the would-be savior being unable to convince the woman. In fact, she seems to think that the man trying to coax her from her car is the real threat, and ends up driving away from him in fear. The Good Samaritan ultimately walks away from the situation, feeling they have failed to save her, and is left haunted by the gruesome possibilities of the woman's fate. Now, perhaps many of these stories are fake, perhaps originating from my own experience and all the publicity that it attracted, but maybe, well, Mina still remains at large to this day. It stands to reason that she may have found a new partner, and that they both may still be out there somewhere, trolling for more hapless victims. I can't help but think I need to get this warning out there to all who may come across a similar experience. I am certainly not saying that you should never risk yourself to save an innocent. Valor and bravery are some of humanity's best qualities. I am simply cautioning you to do all in your power to ensure that the person you're trying to save really is innocent. Now, with all the darkness in this story, there is one element of light that I wish to leave you with, and it is an absolute fact that is corroborated by the numerous police reports regarding this incident. While the police were still searching for myself and Mina in the cornfields, they drove straight past that old barn without seeing it. It was so shrouded in darkness and overgrowth that, just like myself, they hadn't seen it from the road. It was only after driving several miles past it that a woman had called the emergency services line and directed them to go back and look specifically for the barn. The call only lasted a minute or two before the woman abruptly hung up, and the only information they had to go on concerning the caller's identity was her first name, Samantha, just like my mother. There will always be forces of evil at work in this world. That has always been, and always will be a sad fact of life. Though perhaps on that night of so much pain and darkness, there was also a strong force for good. I'm sure many of you will say that phone call to the police was simply a coincidence, and that my mother was long dead, and could not have possibly been the one to make it. As for myself, I have only one thing left to say. Thank you, Mom. When I moved into my house with my wife, we weren't that well off. I'd gotten fired a while back and my wife was working at a place that really didn't pay well. We had to move to accommodate me into my brand new job, and we were excited. We chose a small little house that was pretty cheap, and we were pretty okay with it. We just wanted to be stable and finally be able to adopt a kid. We lived in that house for about 2 years when I heard some gnawing or scratching in the wood above the ceiling. God damn it, was my first thought. We had mice. I knew what mice sounded like. This wasn't my first rodeo. They were cute, in a rodent kind of way, but I knew that soon enough, they would tear into anything we ever had. I had mice in my childhood home, and their poop was everywhere. We would be in real trouble if they ever made their way into the bedrooms. I wanted to set sticky traps or rat poison, but my wife was an animal lover. She convinced me to go get the humane traps. We would set about 10 of those in the attic each night, and at least 7 traps would actually catch one of the bastards. We would then release them a few miles away in the woods, and then go back home and do everything over again. I was tired and annoyed at the practice. I really didn't care about the safety of the mice, but my wife would get so protective if she saw one, and would nearly cry if she found a dead mouse. I would like to say her behavior bothered me, but her kind heart was one of the reasons I even married her, so I just went along. Eventually, it turned out for the worst. The kitchen and basement were completely overrun. No matter how many we caught, 20 more would appear. It was awful, and we had to throw away a lot of food that got infested. I was ready to buy rat poison, but my wife begged me not to. I knew she was stubborn, but she hit me with her classic spiel. Why is it okay if we kill a mouse but not kill a dog? They're both living things. They didn't choose to create a problem for us. I would argue back sometimes, but I would rather deal with my wife than force to deal with that rat poison. We were forced to abandon our kitchen cabinets and drawers, which were filled with mouse droppings, and clean dishes immediately after eating. No snacks allowed anywhere other than over the sink, and we had to buy more traps. Finally, I had a talk with my wife and she hesitantly nodded and agreed with me that we needed to do something serious about these mice. We couldn't live like this, and we didn't have enough saved up to move somewhere new, nor hire an exterminator. I bought the poison, sticky traps, and a big jar of peanut butter, and left the poison and sticky traps in the back of my car. I don't know why, but I just had the thought, I'll put it in next week. I just grabbed the peanut butter and the rest of my groceries and headed inside for the night. The next day, I heard my wife scream bloody murder. I jumped up from bed, my hair and face a sleepy mess, and ran over to her. She was shrieking like a madman, and she pointed to something on the floor. I took a closer look and saw that it was a mouse. A dead mouse. That wasn't that big of a deal. We saw dead mice quite often throughout the kitchen. What was strange was that it was half a mouse. Like it was bitten in half and the head part was the only thing left, and it was oozing blood. We didn't have any pets, nor any other pests except for ants in the summer. I didn't know what the hell happened, but it certainly freaked me out, and my wife even more. I had to console her and we went out to eat to calm her nerves. She felt a lot better after that, and by the time we got in the car to go home, she was laughing again. But when we came home, we checked the traps that we usually set, and only about 3 mice were there. I thought, that's a lot less than usual. So I decided that maybe I could wait on the rat poison. Maybe there was some mouse disease that was going around. Dumb thinking on my part. But there were no other signs of raccoons or possums or wild cats. Nothing. I took a flashlight to the attic a few days after and saw nothing except a lot of gnawed wood. Was obviously my first reaction. But I was a little relieved that there weren't any other animal droppings other than those of the mice. I shrugged and decided to just continue on with my day. The dead mouse was really strange, but I guess I thought that mice were insanely clicky. Oh well. I can't really do anything about it, so I'll just go to sleep. A little thing about me, I'm a very light sleeper. I wake up at the littlest thing, and it's extremely annoying for me. So a few nights back, I woke up to a thudding sound, louder than any mouse I've ever heard. I furrowed my brows, and instinctively wrapped my arms tighter around my wife. Was it a possum or something? I heard they are also commonly found in attics. I stayed awake for another 5 minutes before I heard a low groan. It was like a human groaning, but it wasn't a groan in pain. It sounded very satisfied or victorious. I felt a cold sweat coming over me as the thudding and the moan grew louder, and the noise came right above my head. Something was in the attic. It was closer to me than I wanted it. Then, an ear-piercing screech. That was definitely a mouse. My wife spoke up and asked me what was happening. I told her to go back to sleep, and then we both heard another screech, then another. My wife was wide awake now, and she kicked off our covers, sitting up in shock. She grabbed me by my tank top involuntarily, and I sat up too. We both stared at the ceiling together, shaking nervously. A soft crunch, and then another, and another, like how a dog would quietly bite through a chicken bone. Silence. "What was that?" my wife asked, staring at me in horror. "Is it an animal?" "I don't know. It's probably a possum eating something it stole from the kitchen. Ignore it." I responded nonchalantly as I didn't want to set her off or anything. I tried to not show her that I was absolutely terrified out of my wits. That groan, that didn't belong to any animal I heard of, but it was too little to start a witch hunt over, so I reassured her it wasn't anything bad. We both went back to sleep, but I had a hard time drifting off. The next day, stupid me decided to check the attic again, maybe to clear my mind of fear. I don't know. I collapsed the attic stairs, went up, and turned on my flashlight again to take a look around. The lights immediately caught a fresh spot of blood on a wooden beam, and my heart picked up. It was clearly smeared by separate fingers, not splattered. I nearly fell off the stairs. Something with 5 long, distinct fingers had smeared blood on the wall. I don't know if I made a noise. I don't remember much except the piercing fear of finding that blood on the beam. Like that, a groan picked up. An excited one, and my gut told me to get out of there. I immediately went down the steps and closed up the attic, as very heavy thuds began making its way across the far side of the ceiling to where I was. Right below it, there was scratching and more groaning, but after 30 minutes, the thing gave up and trudged away. I was sweating bullets, and my legs collapsed under me. I was nauseous and my stomach dropped. I think I dropped my flashlight, but I didn't even notice. I was so scared. What the hell was that? Those thuds or footsteps were fast, really fast. If it was an animal, why did it come towards me? Why didn't it run away? I never went up into the attic ever again, and I didn't tell my wife until we were eating dinner. She paused and looked at me. "I love you, but I'm not in the mood for horror stories today," she said in a hushed tone, as if she was trying to convince herself that I was lying. I began, before I realized that she wouldn't believe me. I was putting everything out of proportion because I heard a few sounds. Those groans, those smears, those footsteps. That wasn't from a possum. I began looking up listings for apartments or houses over the next few days. I didn't want to be near that thing in the attic anymore. I didn't want my wife near it, and I definitely don't want any future kids even near the house, much less live in it. A few days after, my wife called me over to take a look at the traps in the kitchen and basement. They were all empty, and have been for the entire day. I shivered in my spot. Oh God, has that thing been making its way into my kitchen? It's getting closer. "Did you put that poison you bought in the attic?" my wife asked me, snapping me out of my stupor. "No, it's still in my car," I responded. She nodded before smiling brightly. "That means the mice are leaving. Isn't that great?" I nodded after a few seconds, before laughing nervously and putting my arm around her. I couldn't sleep that night. I didn't hear the mice gnawing or scratching, but I heard that thing growling angrily. I didn't hear it, nor did I hear the mice scream. I just heard it growl. If the mice are really leaving, or that thing ate them all up, wouldn't it find a new source of food? Bigger prey? It obviously doesn't fear us. I don't know what to do. I'm not sure if I can convince my wife to give up our savings and move to another place in time. I know we can't stay here, but I don't know how to live. I just pray to God each night that the mice will come back and let me live another day. You're likely listening to this right now, and will soon be thinking that you could find a cure or something that will end whatever the hell this thing is. But all you'll find is one scary little story that you have to believe. So for the remaining bit of your life, continue listening. It all started when I went to visit my parents in the farmlands of Maryland. I live in DC, so I visited them often. As I pulled up the bumpy driveway, a sense of dread came over me, but this was different. It was something so strong. This wasn't the type of dread you would feel if you accidentally broke grumpy old man Jake's window with a baseball. It was the type of dread you would feel when you murder another person and the cops are on your trail. As I got out of the car, I just started shaking. Something I have never done out of the blue like this. I decided it was nothing but me being a nervous spaz. I was going to walk it off before visiting my parents. That was the gravest mistake I've ever made. I walked up to the barn where all the animals would be expecting to see me. My favorite pig, Shane, ran up to me. When I didn't see Shane, I knew something was off. As I began walking inside the old familiar barn, I smelled something that I could only describe as death. I could tell since I have dealt with it before when living here. Fearing for the worst, I slowly walked in and nearly vomited at the grotesque sight that I had to witness. All the remaining animals were holding on to their last breath. They were missing eyes and chunks of their face. I could barely even recognize that they were animals because they were all mangled and their bones were chewed. When I examined the lifeless body of what I thought was Shane, I noticed something. A pack of little tiny, yellowish, parasitic worms. At this moment, my pure stupidity kicked in, and I poked the lifeless body with a stick, and the worms latched onto the stick. But one jumped and latched onto my arm. I again stupidly freaked out and dropped the stick. They grabbed onto my leg. I started ripping them off one by one. When I finally got them all off, little tiny holes appeared on my legs and hands. They didn't bleed, but they hurt more than any pain I have ever experienced. I couldn't bear the pain. I had to limp, practically crawling, all the way back to the house. I had to tell my parents what happened, but when I got to the door, there were little holes in the wood. The house smelled of decay and death. I then experienced a blinding fear when I walked to the family room, where my parents usually are. I froze. Their half-eaten corpses lie on the couch, the expression of fear frozen on what remained of their faces. On the couch next to my parents was a pile of those yellow worms trying to eat their way through the couch, with some being still on my parents. The last thing I remember from that moment on was how quickly I ran, sprinted, aimlessly looking for help or a sign of life. On the road there were dead animals, but they weren't roadkill. They were rotting and half devoured the same way as my parents and the animals on the farm were. People on the streets were also decaying and chewed up. I'm hiding now, writing this to you, hoping these things don't spread anymore. I don't know where they came from or what they are, but this might be your only hope. If everyone isn't dead, spread this story and save me. My hands and legs hurt. It feels like something is moving and squirming around in the holes. I'll update you, if I'm still alive, and if the pain will ever leave. Update. Feel them crawling up my veins. I don't know how I'm typing this. They're slowly corroding away my brain, and I feel them and see them emerging from my mangled hand. I don't think I...
Number 1. The gas station. This is true, and it only happened a few days ago. And honestly, I wasn't really sure what was happening until after it actually happened. I was walking out to a local gas station. I don't keep soda in the house because if I do, I will end up drinking it all. So when I decide I want one, and I can't drink that diet stuff, I just take enough money to buy the soda and nothing else. And then I walk to a gas station that is a little over a mile from my home. Now the day was really hot. Before I went out, I checked the temperature. It was 85 degrees outside, and the humidity was fairly high. The website told me that it felt like it was going to be in the mid-90s outside, so I knew that I was going to be soaked in sweat by the time I got home. But I was still having the craving, so I figured it was worth it. I live in a neighborhood set on the street out of town, so I have to walk into town to get to the gas station. By the time that I made it to the gas station, I was already sweating pretty badly. There were a lot of cars out that day. I was the only person, though, that seemed to be crazy enough to go for a walk. I bought my drink and then I walked out of the gas station. As I was walking away in the parking lot, I heard someone yelling, "Hey!" really loudly. Now normally, I would not pay any attention to someone yelling out like that outside. I lived in this town for a really long time, but I work at home, so I really don't know many people. However, a memory from before suddenly occurred to me. A couple of years ago, I had an encounter with a homeless person who'd been yelling "hey" at me repeatedly before deciding to attack me. Worried it might be that guy again, and not wanting to be attacked from behind, I turned around and looked back in the direction that I had heard the "hey" come from. Well, to my relief, it wasn't the homeless guy from a few years before. It was some guy sitting in the passenger seat of a car. There was no one in the driver's seat, so I assumed the driver was inside the gas station. The passenger was sitting slumped down in his seat, his arm leaning on the window pane of the door. His face was partially hidden behind his arm. The guy was talking to me because he continued to address me. "Hey, do you need a ride somewhere?" he yelled at me. He was still keeping his face behind his arm. As is often the case, especially on a hot and humid day, I do always consider taking a ride when it is offered to me. However, more often than not, I will refuse a ride. I mean, you never really know who you're getting into a car with when you get into one with a stranger. So I just waved my hand, told him no thank you, and was about to turn around and leave. As I turned, he said something else to me, but with his mouth still behind the arm, I really couldn't make out what he was saying, so I wasn't sure how to respond to him. I just basically told him, "Thank you," and tried to turn around to walk on my way again. As I turned away from the man, he yelled something at me again. This time he seemed annoyed, however, and slightly on the verge of anger. Sort of as a force of habit, turning back towards a voice when it speaks to you, I turned and looked at the guy. This time, he had his face up over his arm. And that was when I finally recognized the guy. About 2.5 years ago, I had an altercation with a guy at my gym. He was harassing me in the gym when we were the only two people in the gym. This was about 2 o'clock in the morning. After I left the gym, I was walking down to the local Walmart to get a few items. While there, the guy followed me from the gym and tried to attack me in the parking lot. Fortunately, because the guy was so much bigger than I was, I am trained in self-defense. I was able to not only protect myself, but I was able to break the guy's arm too. And to add insult to injury, the guy had his gym membership revoked for harassing me while at the gym. Well, I realized when I had turned around and saw the guy, it was that guy. I suddenly pictured what might have happened if I had gotten into that car. It was a 2-door car, so I wouldn't have been able to get out of it unless he let me. And I might have gotten into the car before I was able to recognize who the guy was. Well, I turned and began walking away from him. I was a bit paranoid, of course, but I was also walking through town on a very busy day. There were a lot of cars out, and a lot of people were out at the businesses. But even so, I was a bit scared as I walked. I crossed a side road and walked into the parking lot of the local liquor store, and while I was turning to walk away across that side road, I noticed the car pulling up behind me slowly. And then it followed me across the street into the parking lot of the liquor store. I was pretty worried at that point. There was no reason for this guy to be following me other than if he was up to something that might hurt me. So I was very nervous and felt some fear despite the environment, which did seem protective. I was wondering if I could get up and into the liquor store before the car could catch up to me. It would be close. It was right then that I got very fortunate, though. Behind the liquor store was a very popular Mexican restaurant, and the fortunate thing is that the police in the area very often eat at that restaurant. And right then, 3 cop cars pulled out of the restaurant onto the side road, and pulled up between the liquor store and the gas station. Well, now the police were just stopping at a stop sign in order to turn onto the main road. They were not aware what was going on with me in the other car, but fortunately, seeing the 3 cars pull up must have convinced the 2 guys in the car to give up doing whatever they were trying to do. The car pulled away from me and then pulled out onto the main road. It sped away onto the main road. I was on edge for the rest of the walk home. I kept expecting the car to come back and for that guy to attack me with his friend or something, but fortunately, that did not happen. The walk home was nerve-wracking, but safe. All I can do from now on is carry something to protect myself going forward.
When I was in high school, I knew my parents' divorce was imminent. My mom was cheating on my dad, and my dad was cheating on my mom. I did everything I could to prevent my parents divorcing, but I knew it was a lost cause. My mother had been planning to leave him for a long time and eventually served him on my 17th birthday. They agreed to live under the same roof until I was out of high school, so I wouldn't have the stress of having 2 homes. When I was a little over 18, my mom had been consistently conversing with men on multiple dating apps. She even got an app that I was known to use called Kick Messenger. She fell asleep with the app open one night, and I'd seen that she was messaging a man named, I'm not sure if I'm going to use his name due to privacy concerns, obviously. I ignored it, but I'd known the name and seen the face multiple times on her cell phone. Fast forward maybe 2 months. My dad and I were just spending time together and wanted to go out somewhere to eat. His friend called him up that night. My dad has been known to be a social drinker who frequented local bars. He had many good friends that were bartenders and fellow social drinkers. His friend was at a local bar and met a man named AJ, who was looking for my father by name in order to buy a vehicle. My dad is a car sales manager, so we stopped by the bar that night because we thought we'd eat there. The bar isn't shabby, or the typical bar most would think of. We live in a small town and the bar was on the lake and people could rent lots to put their campers on it. It was like a club lodge. The man introduced himself as AJ. However, I recognized him immediately as the man who my mother had been conversing online with. I didn't say anything to my dad at first. I for sure thought he just looked similar and I was overreacting. That is, until he called me by my full name without anyone introducing him to me or even saying my name. He knew my first, middle, and last name. He also came up to greet me at the table I was sitting at. He tried getting me to open lotto tickets for him and was rubbing up against me and trying to touch my inner thighs. I was kind of frozen and didn't know what to do. He eventually left me alone after he saw people staring at him. I did what I knew I had to do. I googled his first name on Google and Facebook, and that's when I found out that he was a registered offender, ex-con in the bordering state over. I looked repeatedly from AJ to the man on my phone screen, and there was no doubt he was the same dude. He only lived about 30 minutes away from our own home. I pulled my dad to the side and told him that this man was not who he said he was. I showed him the picture and the information I'd found. I ran to the bathroom crying because I knew something bad was happening. He lied about his name, knew both me and my father's names, and knew where my father worked. After hearing this info, my dad refused to go outside with AJ. He made multiple attempts at getting my dad outside alone to take a look at my dad's truck, due to the fact he wanted something similar. He eventually stopped pushing my dad and went outside for a smoke. The manager at the bar immediately locked the doors and locked him outside, refusing to let him back in. Everyone in the bar, most of them were close friends of my dad, had seen how suspicious he was acting, and many had seen him rubbing up against me. The manager called the cops to report him. It didn't take long for him to figure out that he had been caught, and he attempted to leave the bar and drive away. My dad followed him up the road, trying to make sure he didn't get away. However, he was plastered and ended up crashing into the snowbank just up the road from the bar. He was caught by the police and charged with a DWI. He was jailed just 5 minutes up the road from home. I did not sleep a good night's sleep for about a month. If he knew my family as well as he seemed to, he probably knew where I lived. He was bailed out only 2 days after the incident. His vehicle had been found with duct tape, drugs, rope, a crowbar, and other materials in it when they impounded his car. He was also charged for violating his probation. He is a Tier 3 offender. He'd raped a minor with a deadly weapon and was required to register for life. He was not supposed to leave the state at the time of the incident, not supposed to have a Facebook or almost any form of social media where he could reach a minor, and was not allowed to even operate his vehicle due to his license being taken away. I also ended up pressing charges for sexual harassment as well as getting a restraining order against him. I also found out later through phone records and the police tracking his phone that he'd driven past my home more than 20 times in the week leading up to the incident. He had also been to my dad's job and my school multiple times throughout a period of 6 months. He'd been following both of us for a long time. I have never experienced something so crazy or scary in my life. I live in a completely different state, thousands of miles away now, thank God. But my family is still in that state that the incident happened. He still has yet to be charged or arrested with the harassment stalking charges, and probably never will be, seeing as if he comes back to the state, he can be arrested if he so much as gets pulled over because he has a warrant out for his arrest. Since then, I do not ever put my full name on any social media. I only put my first name except for things like Facebook. I've become a very paranoid person when it comes to my full name and my address or other personal info. Please everyone, be careful who you talk to on these dating sites. You never know who's behind the screen or what their true intentions are. And if you do find someone you like, investigate and do your homework. I lived in a town with a population of 5,000 and never once thought this kind of thing could happen to me.
Number 3. The Alley. I had an unusually bad night a while back. I was a bit emotionally shook up for relationship reasons. I also wasn't feeling too positive about myself. And although my job had been going pretty well, I found myself not putting the effort into it that I could have been doing. All this caused me to have problems with insomnia as well, and so on the night that this happened, I was absolutely having a really hard time sleeping. I was tossing and turning in bed for hours. I know that you're supposed to get up if you cannot fall asleep, and to try again later, but I always try too hard to force myself to sleep. I finally decided to get up and take a walk. It was warm outside, being in the middle of summer, but it was also a lot cooler after the sun had gone down. But mostly, it was really dark and really quiet outside. If you've ever taken one of those types of walks before, then you sort of know what I'm talking about. So I began walking through this really dark street. It's almost like an alley, but it's not really an alley, but there are not many lights there. But I walked up and down that street all the time. One of the things about this area is that a lot of people had dogs that they kept constantly in their backyards. They are mostly totally outside dogs. If I walked down the alley, the dogs were really used to me, so they would very rarely bark, if ever. But if I walked down the alley with someone the dogs did not know, they would get loud and they would bark a lot. This time, as I was walking and just enjoying how dark and quiet it was, I heard one of the dogs begin barking. It startled me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. And, as is always the case, it set off a chain reaction of dogs barking. I didn't really concern myself with what was going on, though. The dogs barked a lot, and dog barking at night was not really a big deal in this area. I even doubted that with the amount of dog barking in this neighborhood, that it was going to wake anybody up. My only thought was to get to the end of the alley so the dogs would stop. I knew I was passing by the backyard now of the dog that started the chain of barking, and just by chance I looked over the house. There were no lights really, but that didn't stop me from seeing a dark figure at the back of the house. I froze when I noticed this figure, and it was quite obvious now that whoever it was, they were not supposed to be there. Not only that, but he was crouched down as if he was hiding. I assumed later that he was crouching down because he was afraid that the dogs would bring attention to him, and he didn't want to get caught. At the time, I wasn't thinking that the guy might have also noticed me walking by, and maybe that was why he was crouching down, and by stopping and looking at him, I may have blown my opportunity to just walk by safely. I don't know how long we stood there looking at each other. Each moment I was trying to decide what the best thing to do was. I could have just ran, and he might not have chased me. He may have decided I couldn't make out his features because he couldn't make out mine, so he was safe. But if I did that, what would keep him from continuing to break into the house? I am not sure how long it took me to finally do something, but when I did, I yelled out really loud for someone to get up and call the police, and right when I did, the figure pounced and ran in my direction. I was terrified, but he wasn't actually attacking me. The man just ran to the road and took off, thankfully, in the opposite direction that I had to go in. And strangely enough, no one actually seemed to wake up or call the police. I waited and watched, but nothing. So at that point, I decided just to make my way home. I was nervous the whole way there. Hell, I was nervous even after I got home. I had no idea who this guy was or if he had followed me home in the dark. So before going to bed, I made sure every door and window in my home was very secure, and even then, it was hard to go to sleep. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, feel free to click the subscribe button and the bell below, or wait for the icon of Ichigo the Cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.